Okay, so in this video, I will tell you what functions are and how we can use functions in our code. Okay, so you can think of a function as a box in which we have some code and that code does something. And then we call the function from another place in our code. And a function can have an input and an output. The input and the output are optional. So a function does not need to have an input and an output necessary, but it can have it. And according to these elements, we can define three types of functions. So the first type of function that we can define is the function with no input and no output. So to define a function, first of all, we need to specify the type of the function. The type of the function will tell us what type of variable the function outputs itself. So in this case, this function does not have any output, so the data type will be the type void. The name of the function comes next, so it is common practice that we start the name of the function with a capital letter. In this case, it's a capital M. And then we put the input inside some parentheses. In this case, this function does not have input, so we have nothing inside the parentheses. So what does this function do? Well, this function prints hello to the console. This is the code that this function has in between the curly brackets. Alright, so this is the first type of function. Now let's go and take a look at the second type of functions. The second type of functions are the functions that take no input and that have an output. So in this case, when we define this kind of function, we need to specify the data type of the function, and in this case, we need to specify which type of variable of data this function is going to output. So in this case, the type of variable that this function is going to output is an integer, so the data type must be an int. The name of the function is the same name, and this function takes no input. So inside the function, we are declaring an integer called num, and that num has a value of 3, and we are returning that number. So this is the value that this function is going to return. Alright, so now let's take a look at the third type of function that we have. The third type of function that we have is a function with input and with output. So it has both. So when we declare this type of function, we need to declare the data type that is going to output. So it could be an integer and a string. In this case, it's an int. So we know that if this function is of type int, that is going to return an integer. Then the name of the function, and then since this type of function has input, we need to specify the input inside the parentheses. In this case, it takes two arguments. The first argument is an integer called num1, and the second argument is an integer called num2. Inside the function, we declare a variable called result, and result is equal to num1 plus num2, and then we return that result. Okay, so that was the third type of function. So now, how do we call a function? Okay, because we know how to create a function, but how do we declare it? So here we have an example. We have an example of a class, and here we have our start method, and here we have the function. So we declare the function outside the start method. Here we have a function of type void called myFunction, takes in two inputs, so num1 and num2, and it prints the result of those inputs. So this function does not return anything, but it prints the result to the console. So how do we call myFunction? So here in the start method, we declare two numbers. We say that number 1 is equal to 34 and number 2 is equal to 26, and then we call a function. So to call a function, we just type in the name of the function, and inside the parentheses, we specify the inputs that function is going to take, if it's going to take any input at all. In this case, this function takes two inputs. So every time we call this function, we need to make sure that it takes two inputs. So the inputs are integers. So that's what we did here. We declared two integers, number 1 and number 2, and we are calling the function with those integers, with the first argument and the second argument. So this function is going to add 32 plus 26, and is going to print that result to the console. Alright, so here we have a challenge. In this challenge, I want you to create 4 functions of type void that take two numbers and print the result to the console. The first function adds the numbers, the second function subtracts the numbers or takes away the numbers one from each other, the third function divides the numbers, and the fourth function multiplies the numbers. Then we should call each function from the start function. Okay, so to do this, let's go to Visual Studio, and in Visual Studio, here we have our start method. Here's where we're going to call our functions, but first of all, we need to define the functions. So outside the start method, we're going to define a function of type void called add, and inside the parentheses we're going to specify two arguments or two inputs. The first input we're going to call it num1, for example, and the second input we're going to call it num2. So the name of these inputs do not matter at all. Okay, these are not important. So here I just misspelled. It's not a semicolon that we need to put, but a comma to separate the arguments. Okay, so inside this add function, we need to specify what it is going to do. So we said that it's going to print out the result to the console. So let's print num1 plus num2. So that's it. That's what it's going to do. We're going to print the result of adding num1 plus num2. Now we need to create three other functions that subtract, multiply, and divide the numbers. So for the purpose of doing it a little bit more quickly, we're going to just copy and paste. So hit Ctrl+C, select Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V, and paste it 4 times. And now you can see that if we leave it like this, there's like a red line below the add name, the name of the function. That's because we cannot have two functions with the same name. So let's change the name to subtract. Let's change the name of the third function to divide, for example, and the fourth function we'll call it multiply. Like this. Okay, so now we just have to change the type of operation that we're doing inside the print statement. If we're subtracting the numbers, then it's a minus. If we're dividing, we should type in a slash like this. And if we are multiplying, we should type in an asterisk. Okay, so now we have our 4 functions defined. We have defined our 4 functions, but now for these functions to work, we need to actually call them from somewhere. In this case, we're going to call them from the start method. Before doing that, we're going to create 2 numbers. So int number, for example, number1 equals 3. And int number2 equals 3. We'll just create 2 integers. The first one is going to be a 3 and the second one a 3. Okay, and now we're going to just call the function. So to call the functions, we need to type in the name of the function and then the arguments or the inputs. In this case, the inputs for this function and for every single function is going to be 2 integers. So we're going to just put in number1 and number2. Okay, so let's do it. Number1, comma, number2, like this. Okay, and remember to end the statement with a semicolon like this. Now let's do this, the next one. Subtract let me subtract like this, open parentheses, number1 and number2, and we're gonna call divide number1 and number2, and multiply number1, number2, like this. Okay, so now we have called the four functions that we created. So now we should see the print statements on the console. So let's hit Ctrl+S, go to the Unity editor, hit play. And now in the console, we should see the results. So we see 6 for the addition, 0 for the subtraction, 1 for the division, and 9 for the multiplication. So everything is working. So that was it for functions. I'll see you in the next video.